We are gathered here today to witness late gestation and birth of a program in the Pardee Center that deals with the science of coupled human and natural systems, but in a multidisciplinary way. And this is one of the products of something that was organized a few years ago at BU called the Earth Systems Forum. Today, you can't escape hearing every day about global climate change, economic, social, cultural globalization. But we tend to think less about what the future will look like as a product of the interaction between humanity's overpowering presence on Earth and the ability of the natural systems we depend upon to support continued growth and development. And so the Pardee Center is forming, congealing, a program around this issue. And today is kind of a practice session to begin talking about the work that different faculty are doing and begin to think what the core elements of such a program might be. And this is a program of research, of training, mostly for the fun of collegiality and for whatever intellectual and practical fruits that might result from it. We have with us here today, I'm from the biology department and the Center for Ecology and Conservation Biology, as well as Pardee Center. We have with us my dear friend and colleague Cheryl Knott from the Department of Anthropology, and my dear colleague and gradually becoming friend Susie Foster from the School of Public Health and Hygiene. And I'll ask Cheryl and Susie to speak about their work and perspectives first, and then I'll wrap it up and we'll have a discussion. Susie.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I decided to start with the governance part of our triad of culture, governance, and ecosystems, or ecosystems. I'm going to start at the end, at the governance side, to reflect a little bit on the situation with regard to the health, the governance of the health sector. And I thought about it, and I thought, wow, it's actually not a pretty picture, because the health sector is one of the weaker sectors. Typically, the Ministry of Health is a low-prestige ministry. Actually in Indonesia, I don't know if this is still true, it was actually designated a second-class ministry. And the BKKBN, the family planning, was a higher class. So it was entitled to a better class of buildings, more nice furniture, and more windows and better equipment and so on. So it starts out with this problem that it's low on the perception scale. Especially in comparison with economic growth, military, and the defense sectors, the finance sector. And there are a number of reasons for this. One is that it's perceived to be a consumption sector. It doesn't produce, it consumes. So that kind of automatically puts it, it's kind of like a beggar, oh please sir, can I have some more, constantly. It's always short of funds. It's also perceived to be providing generally lower quality care than is available in the private sector. Typically, the elites do not use the Ministry of Health facilities. They'll use private or military or other kinds of facilities if they have healthcare needs, or they'll go out of the country, often using government funds, even ministry funds, to go on health evacuations. Actually, in Niger, this is quite a while ago, but we estimated that 10% of the Ministry of Health budget was spent on medical evacuations to Paris for 200 individuals. So 10% of the budget was going to about 200 people. And about half of them were on kidney dialysis, so they were not returning to Niger. So, also another common feature of the Ministry of Health is the minister is often a doctor, almost always. And quite often it's the friend of the president. So a cardiologist, or a surgeon, or someone who's not necessarily a public health doctor. So we kind of start out with someone who's not necessarily the best prepared to make decisions that have wide public health importance. And generally the ministries of health are occupied with getting to Thursday. It's crisis management, one thing after the other. Drug shortages, staff strike, nursing strike, doctors strike, epidemics, and so on. So they're in permanent crisis mode. And so the notion of planning for especially in environmental, or having an intervention or interaction even with other ministries on some environmental issues would be, I think in a lot of cases, be a little bit far from their top concern. And the other final thing to say about the governance side of things is, for the most part, in the lower income countries, and even in many of the lower middle income countries, they are not the masters of their agenda. Their agendas are set largely by donor influence. Because they're so dependent on donor funding, the donors call the shots. And so then we run into the problem that the symbolism in terms of the donors becomes very important. And this is why, and I'll speak to this a little bit more in a minute, but the burden of disease has shifted radically in the last couple of decades, but most notably in the last 10 years, away from infectious disease and towards non-communicable diseases. And yet, it's still much more satisfying, I think, from a donor perspective to be addressing the problems of sick children, sick babies, mothers dying in childbirth, as opposed to fat people drinking Cokes, munching Doritos, or smoking a cigarette. But yet that's where the new burden of disease really lies. It's the fat person smoking a cigarette that we need to be addressing. So, as I said, there has been a major shift in the burden of disease over the last 20 or so years, but most notably, even more recent than that. We have now, I've even heard it termed a tsunami of cancer coming, but also cardiovascular disease, which is still the leading cause of disease in almost every country of the world. And mental health problems and diabetes are really overtaking the other causes of morbidity and mortality, even in the lowest income countries. We're really seeing this happen very quickly. However, as I mentioned, the money to deal with these problems is not shifting. It's lagging well behind. So these problems are causing 70 to 80% of morbidity and mortality, and yet they're drawing about 2% of donor funding. So we see that in the ministries of health, they're totally behind the curve in terms of keeping up with these problems. And the non-communicable disease part of the ministry will be 2 or 3 people compared to a couple of hundred dealing with all the other problems. So it's still, they're so well behind the getting mastery of these problems. Another thing that's happened very, very rapidly, I was going to show an animation of this, but it's not possible, but I can actually direct you to the website of gapminder.org, which is a fabulous, even if you don't love statistics, he will make you love statistics. This is Hans Rosling, who's a professor at Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, and he has done wonders for our approachability, for the approachability and availability of statistics. And it's all graphic. I really urge you to go and play around with his site. He named it Gapminder after the Mind the Gap in the London Underground. So I don't know why, but he did. He's quite a character, actually. If you go on YouTube, you can see, I don't know if I should spoil the surprise. He swallows a sword. He literally does swallow, not just a big long sword, just to show that the impossible is now possible. So anyway, he's quite a character.
We should be training our students.
Absolutely.
Transportable skills.
Well, it's very funny because he's about 60 years old, and he rips off his shirt and has this Swedish undershirt on, which is not a very sexy thing. And he's not got a very sexy body either. And then he pulls out this sword. And anyway, it's quite funny. But aside from swallowing swords, he's done a marvelous job of bringing statistics, making them more available and accessible. So you can see graphically on some of his animations that about 1970 was the turning point where life expectancy was increasing, but number of children was about the same. And at 1970, 1971, all of a sudden you see this falling off of the number of children. And so we have seen the majority of the regions of the world, with mostly the exception of sub-Saharan Africa, the number of children has gone from 5, 6, 7 to 2 or 3 within the last 20 years, 30 years. So that now Mexico used to have child size of 6 or 7, and now child size is about 2 to 3, number of children per family. This is a radical, radical change. This is going to change our immigration picture without anything else happening, because there's not that many children being born in Mexico who are going to be wanting to come and work here in the U.S. So it's a major, major change. China, so it means that people are living longer and we have much higher dependency ratios. And China is the real poster child for high dependency ratios, where they have this problem they call the 4-2-1 problem, 4 grandparents and 2 parents being supported by 1 child. And if you think of being that child, you are the only support for those 2 parents and those 4 grandparents. That's 6 people with all their aches and pains and actually storing up quite a lot of very poor health, because China has some of the worst health indicators in the whole world, and I'll mention this in a minute. Actually, I'll just mention one thing. China is the only country I could find that has cancer as its #1 cause of death. The only country I could find. Almost every other country has cardiovascular disease as #1, but not China. And they've recently admitted to having cancer clusters. They call them cancer villages. Just last month, the government finally admitted that they admitted to 200 villages and towns where there are major clusters of cancer. Other observers say it's actually much more than 400, but at least there's a start in admitting to the 200. Another thing we have is a situation whereby there are too many or underemployed young men out in the world who are sexually frustrated because they're not married. Either there aren't enough women to go around because of sex imbalance, gender imbalance in births and also in infanticide, but also the costs of getting married are so high they can't afford to get married. So they're in their 30s, even into their 40s, very frustrated and ripe pickings for terrorism and all kinds of unrest. These men in India who took the couple and eventually murdered the girl, she died. Those were men who'd come from the village, they were underemployed or unemployed, looking at all the wonders the city has to offer, and nothing for them. And they took their anger out on this couple who got on their fake bus. And it's really shocking. The level of violence against women seems to me has skyrocketed. And I think in large part it's down to this large number of men who don't have, they're unmarried and very frustrated. On the kind of the good news side, the HIV/AIDS epidemic is slowly coming under control. We have about half of the eligible people who would be eligible for antiretroviral treatment are now on treatment, so 50% is way better than it used to be. This is largely helped by the recent documentation of something we all thought for a long time but weren't able to prove, that treatment is prevention, that if you treat people, it lowers their viral load so that they're no longer infectious. So we're going to have a lot more people living with HIV. So the number of people living with AIDS or HIV is going to be increasing. But that doesn't mean that we're failing, because a lot of them are living because they're on treatment. What is coming after that, though, in a lot of cases, is cancers. They are, even though they're on antiretrovirals, they are susceptible to cancers. And so we're seeing in some of the heavily affected countries, in Botswana, for example, a new burden of cancer coming on in the wake of the HIV epidemic, which is cancers in people with HIV. And that is putting a big burden on the health services to deal with that. As far as climate change goes, we're seeing new diseases in new places, or old diseases in new places. Dengue fever, actually, I've forgotten all about my slides. Let me see what there is here. Okay, sea level rise. Yes, sea level rise. Let me talk about that first. All the places in red. So this is this a pointer? Let's see.
No pointer.
No pointer. Okay. The top slide is the U.S. coast, and all the areas in red would be vulnerable to either 1.5 or 3.5 meter sea level rise. So Miami, real estate, maybe not, or at least something on stilts, high stilts. This is the Nile Delta on the left, and that is a very, very densely populated part of Egypt. And then here, this is Bangladesh, again, the Delta, very heavily populated, many, many millions of people. You know exactly, yeah. Many millions of people live on this on this delta in Bangladesh.
24 million.
24 million. So a sea level rise, I think you probably can't see the colors so well, but most of the rise, actually the colors, I wish they'd chosen some different ones. Anyway, there's a lot of vulnerability there in terms of numbers of people who will have to be relocated if the sea level rises. And this is just unimaginable, really, in terms of where will they go? Bangladesh is so densely populated already. You know, where will they go? It's really, sorry? Oh, I thought somebody was saying something.
They're stunned.
They're stunned. And then, well, I'll keep stunning you. Dengue. Dengue is a hemorrhagic, well, its worst form is a hemorrhagic fever. It's also called colloquially breakbone fever, because that's how it makes you feel, that your bones are breaking. Has been extending its range. The mosquito, and we have had cases in Texas and Florida, imported cases, not quite clear, but cases have been recorded there. But the vector that carries this dengue virus is present in 26 states of the US. Now, West Nile virus started out on the East Coast and very quickly spread all the way across the country. And I don't see, since the vector is present in 26 of our US states, I think we could well see an expansion of the dengue area. And it's a very, it's an urban, largely an urban disease. The vector, Aedes aegypti, can breed in a very small amount of water, like the bottom of a flower pot or tires. They love to breed in the water that's at the bottom of tires. It's very difficult to get it out. And so this is something that's coming along down the road. How am I doing on time? 3 minutes. Okay, I'm going to talk very more quickly about China. So this is so recent. This is 2005, a New England Journal, that this was given a special article. This is a big deal in New England Journal, that China's the disease burden may have changed. And they found in this article that this is one of the ones that published the China's major shift to non-communicable diseases, and the fact that cancers were the #1, followed by cardiovascular disease. But this is recent. This has happened pretty quickly. And this was, it was so newsworthy just, 8 years ago? And so now it's like acknowledged, but as I said before, the funding is lagging behind. The government admitted to these cancer villages about February 20th, roughly. And these are the ones that they published this in one of the Chinese newspapers. But as I say, the activists say that there are many more. And most recently, they've started to, there's this new activism getting started in China. They invited people to post pictures of their local polluted rivers on Weibo, which is the Chinese sort of Twitter. And it's apparently a real risky thing to actually do this. It's punishable because it's slandering the state and so on. But people are sending in many, many of these pictures from the polluted rivers in China. The problem in China is going to be that even if the local government, even if the national government admits that there's a problem, it's up to the local governments to take action. And that's where a lot of the problems really lie. In terms of the governance, the local level is where a lot of the bad things are happening. If you read in the newspapers, people being kidnapped and tortured and so on, a lot of it's being done by the local government. And they're far from the eye of the national authorities, and it's quite a tough situation. I heard a talk that was on the Huffington Post, and the two Chinese scientists were talking, and one said, well, the elites have managed to buy water. You can, in fact, we were talking about it earlier, you don't drink the water out of the tap anywhere in China, not even in Shanghai. Everyone buys water. But you can't buy privileged air. Everyone has to breathe the same air. And that's finally, it seems that may be the thing that finally galvanizes the Chinese population into taking some action on their pollution problems. And so I think I'll stop there and hand you the button.
So is the cancer then caused by pollutants?
Largely. Yes, I forgot to say, lung cancer. Oh, the Chinese are also still huge smokers, encouraged by the government because the government makes a lot of money from tobacco tax, and the government is still one of the large tobacco producers. So lung, liver, stomach, esophagus, and colon. Not breast, interestingly. Still very low. Not clear why. Yeah, and maybe the diet still hasn't caught up. Yeah, the fat.
More breastfeeding.
Yeah, maybe. Fewer children, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Well, my work takes place in Gunung Palung National Park, which is in West Kalimantan, Indonesia. It's on the island of Borneo, and I study wild orangutans there, which is one there. And I've been doing that for about the last 20 years or so. But I'm not going to talk about my primary research today, but about another project. So about 12 years ago or so, we started hearing the sounds of chainsaws sort of approaching to our research site, and really sort of the collision of human and natural worlds, essentially. So not just the coupling, but how they're sort of colliding together. And what we need to do, thinking about what we need to do to stop that. And initially, our approach to how to sort of deal with these two sort of realms of humans and natural systems was to start various programs to try to address those issues. And when we first started this, we thought about, it was more about, protecting the national park and stopping illegal logging from coming in. And now it's really evolved in our area as well as other places, I think, to more of what we call a living landscape, so that there's this sort of mosaic of human and natural areas that are sort of interspersed across this sort of landscape of the area. And that kind of makes a lot of sense in Indonesia, where the national parks are not very well patrolled, and like a lot of places in the world, and the boundaries. You have as many wild orangutans living outside the national park as inside. You have people who are extracting resources from the national park. So there's really this sort of mosaic of human and natural areas with varying degrees of protection. So the problem is then, how can we sort of allow for the sustainable human development, which is happening, as well as protect the wildlife and ensure the ecosystem that both the humans and wildlife are depending on. Anyway, that's just an emblem from our organization, our NGO there. Now, I know it's actually in the title of today's seminar, the word culture, and I'm not a culture anthropologist, but I thought I would mention that because think a little bit about what that means. And I think the reason why it's in the title, and Les can talk about this, is to think about what's the cultural history of an area, the context. And I think one important thing in our area, which I imagine is the same in many other places, is that there is a huge cultural diversity in the area. So without ever being to Borneo, you might think, okay, everybody, I don't know what your image is of the people there, but you might think that
Probably don't want to know.
you might want to think that they're all homogeneous, but actually there's a real big diversity. So we have about 30% ethnic Chinese who have been there for generations. This one in this region. We have Dayaks, who are sort of Christian, some sort of animist history that live there. The traditional people from Borneo. We have the dominant group is people of sort of Malayu, from Malaysian extraction, who are Muslim. Then we have transmigrants. So we have this process where an Indonesian government, where they take people from the outlying, from Java and Bali, where it's overpopulated, and move them to places like Borneo, where there are less people. So they come in with their own different sets of beliefs, and they don't have a rich sort of history in that region. And sometimes those villages actually are some of the biggest sort of villagers that are cutting down rainforests. So there's a big variety of different people, and so when you're thinking about how to interact with sort of humans, there's many different things to consider. So now what I'm going to do is talk about some. Sure. Is it going to work? Okay, thanks. Take a look at it. Maybe the battery may be running out. So what I want to do is give you some, kind of talk about some of the issues in our area. It's kind of a case study in a sense of what's going on in a lot of other places in the world as well, in terms of this sort of human natural systems and what some of the issues are, because I think that they're quite similar throughout the globe. So in our case, so one question is, are there sustainable livelihoods that people can engage in that are wildlife friendly, that don't destroy the ecosystem? And in our case, that would be the problem. The main problem is illegal logging. This is a picture from inside the national park. of illegal logs, trees that have been cut down, and that kind of railroad-like looking structure is called the kuda, where they drag the trees out. So when they cut these big trees, they also have to cut lots of smaller trees to help drag out those trees as well. So now the people who are actually, cutting down the trees, I don't think most people grow up and think, I want to be an illegal logger. I mean, it's difficult work. They don't get paid very much money. They also often become indebted to the boss, who sort of pays for the chainsaw, gives them an advance, and so they have to produce the logs to, in payment for that. So one of the things that our organization does is try to help people find alternatives to illegal logging. And one of the responses is to work with people to find alternatives. So these are using, here's some of these sort of non-timber forest products. So how can you still use the forest but extract things which are renewable, so sustainable kind of products? And so we've started quite a few, help people start these cooperatives, these village cooperatives, where they are making these products that are sort of allowing them, it gives them more investment in protecting the forest because they can get these products from them and actually earn an income that way. Another example is this bamboo chair. We sent people to Java to get training on how to make bamboo furniture, which is also a very sustainable product, very quick growing. And these organizations are also kind of like microcredit. They're helping each other. They sort of advance each other loans and try to work as kind of a cooperative. So that's one example. Another problem, another reason why the rainforest is cut down is because of agriculture. And these rainforest soils are very poor. There's not much nutrients, so they have very, very thin layer of topsoil. So you cut down forests and you plant crops, maybe for a year or two they'll grow, but then you have to cut more down. So they practice a slash and burn agriculture. And you need to sort of keep on encroaching in those areas. So another thing we work with people on doing is helping them use the land they already have more productively. So how can you take what you already have and use that to grow your crops? And because they don't really have a rich history of sort of agriculture or enriching the soil or knowing how to do this, because, well, you just go cut some more forest down. So this program here is, actually just gardening and, planting just a lot of basic procedures of, growing seedlings here in the greenhouse and these poly bags and using those to grow their vegetables. Because you might think that's, somewhat small scale, but actually these families have quite a big impact. So they cut forests down and they plant even just vegetable crops in there. And you've got the whole village doing that, and it's one of the, actually a big source of what causes this rainforest destruction. Now, another area is human-wildlife conflict. So first there's sustainability and how can we help people figure out ways that they can coexist. And then we have sort of conflict, more direct conflict between humans and wildlife. Now, one of the examples you're probably familiar with is, poaching and hunting, which is sort of maybe an extreme example of conflict. And hunting, especially mothers, for the illegal pet trade. This actually man was given this baby orangutan as a wedding gift, and he heard through our radio program that was illegal, and so he actually brought it back to us to get rehabilitated or released later into the wild. So that's one example. But this kind of term, human-wildlife conflict, is becoming increasingly important in not just killing, because killing is actually, conflict kind of implies there's two sides to something, right? And there's not really two sides if you're just killing an animal. So more the conflict comes through in these other areas. So this is a orangutan they called Polanyi, who was caught in a snare in his arm. And you can see this kind of stump. His hand actually is on the sort of left there, and you have the stump there on his right. Sort of hard to exactly make out because there's various pieces of flesh around there. So he was caught in a snare that was set up by people who were trying to trap rainforest deer for hunting. And so it wasn't like they intended to cause this. So it's an outcome of the sort of human use of these habitat areas. And some of our our organization, some of our colleagues who are vets, went in there and we were able to bring him back, sort of anesthetized him, carried him out of the forest, and here he is with his wrapped up arm. And eventually, actually, just a few months ago, he was actually released back to the forest again. So it was actually a real great success story in terms of rehabilitation of this one individual. But we see quite a bit of these kinds of conflicts where animals are caught in something to do with humans. Another really big example throughout Indonesia, especially in Kalimantan, is oil palm. So here is an oil palm plantation which can go on forever. And one of the things about oil palm then is that a lot of companies have signed on to this idea of having their concessions certified as not having orangutans in them, okay, which sounds like a good thing. But then what happens is, so they have this area of rainforest, they want to cut down to plant oil palm, and they find orangutans. So what do? Well, sometimes you kill them, because then there's no orangutans there if you kill the ones that are there. Or you call in people like us or some of our colleagues to remove them and bring them someplace else. So that's another example where you have this conflict and people, maybe don't really want to kill the orangutans there, but they're in the way. We also have examples of forest gardens where these also in the kind of buffer zone between the human areas and the rainforest, where animals, orangutans, will come in and steal, fruit and eat the fruit, which people maybe are using to sell. So it's a cash crop for them, and they're destroying that. Okay, now a third area to think about, which is ubiquitous as well, is sort of spatial planning. So who controls the land? And this is just a map that shows different areas. And these highlighted areas, this is the middle part is the national park. You don't really need to know what all the colors mean, but these different areas are slated to be converted from either rainforest or protected forest to oil palm or to logging concessions. And this is a map that was just released from our area that we're sort of dealing with right now, and how to change those. So you can have lots of programs with local people, but then the government can come in and say, well, actually, we're going to get rid of this area and we're going to plant, this is now going to be a palm oil concession. So you need to work, of course, from the top down as well as the bottom up. So we work with government officials to try to sort of educate them about what the consequences are. And then that's one area where a university can come in, is that we can do sort of surveys and figure out, well, what is the consequence if you get rid of this one area? Are there orangutans there? How many? What happens if you convert that to another kind of habitat? And so that's sort of a top-down approach. More of a bottom-up approach is these community forests. So some people who, traditionally, a lot of the villages around the park, they have their kind of traditional lands that they don't have legal title to. So they're recognized in the community as this village's forest, and they may use that for these traditional forest products. They may have durian trees that can be a huge source of income to the people. And so some of these communities, we're working with them to help them obtain legal title to their lands. And it's kind of an interesting story also how it relates to sort of education. The village head of the first village that we started working with, he had been an illegal logger, and he was hired by FFI, Flora and Fauna International, which is a conservation NGO, to be part of these orangutan protection units, which were basically patrols in the park for logging. And that experience really, sort of convinced him that they shouldn't cut down the forest and kind of turned him into a conservationist. Also, the fact that he worked for this international NGO probably increased his status in the village, and so he was elected as the village head. As quite a young man. And he convinced all the other people in his village that they should protect their forests and not do illegal logging there, and he came to us to help get this sort of process going of certifying that forest. So you can, if you have an effect on certain individuals, it can have big downstream effects. So I just want to end with a few things about thinking about the university's role in some of these and what potentially things could do. And one of them, of course, is education. That's what we do. And in our own program here, we reach everything from kindergartners with puppet shows to teacher trainings there on the bottom right. Also sort of field trips or outdoor conservation education on the top left, and on the top right, sort of classroom education. So, education and helping, awareness and teaching, and what we've learned, maybe here, sort of translating that to other contexts. Another area is in terms of education and things that research that we can convey are things about the ecosystem and how destruction of the ecosystem hurts people. So this is our river in our national park, and all the water from this whole region, all the drinking water, comes from this mountain. And so that's one issue that really resonates with the local people, because they know that, and that they see that you start to destroy the rainforest and you have less water for access. And so that's one of the messages that we can get out to people, and also have data to support that, sort of information, science to support that. And finally, there's also just other kinds of research that we can do. We're right now in dealing with spatial planning. We have surveys where we're trying to assess the orangutans in those areas and the impact of dezoning. With human orangutan conflict, my current research manager did her PhD in Sumatra on that exact issue. So there's actual projects you can do to see what works and what doesn't. We had a Fulbright fellow with us last year who worked with communities around the region to see how they were using the park and what they were extracting, what illegal and legal activities they were doing. So there's a whole, I think, realm of research kind of activities that would be really helpful, like where we work, but also, globally, there's a lot more that could be done to try to think about this sort of, this conflict potentially between humans and the natural systems, and things we can do to address that. Thank you.
Sure. So we don't know quite what to call this. What to call this program yet? There's been some dispute. We started calling it Coupled Human and Natural Systems because CHANS is a pronounceable acronym. But no one knows what the hell we're talking about. And we actually had a kind of a formative meeting prior to this seminar about a month ago, in which we tossed about the term global change adaptation. I think the basic idea here is not only that human and natural systems are really one, and that we're kind of drunk in the driver's seat, but also that the world is changing very rapidly, largely because of processes that we've kicked off, and we'd like to be able to survive the change that we've wrought. It would be pleasant. So sustainability science is really about this constant adaptation to change and ability to better anticipate where change is headed. And we would not be the first university to become interested in this problem. We're actually latecomers. But the question is what our special talents are, our special strengths, so that we can make a contribution in this arena. Some of the noteworthy colleagues in the university world are Stanford, University of Maryland, Columbia, Princeton, and then there are also intergovernmental organizations getting going very rapidly, mostly in Europe. And if you look at their websites, one of them is this European Forum for Forward-Looking Activities, EFLA. And then there's a supercomputer consortium in England where they hope to predict the future of the world. And, it's very ambitious and brazen proposals, but the main thing is that people are thinking about this. So the question is, how can our program develop, and where are the unique frontiers where we can make a difference? One of the exciting initiatives that has been going on this year is led by Dennis, who's sitting in the audience here, Dennis Carlberg. BU has a sustainability office, and there's a wonderful art exhibition right now in the old Cadillac building. Dennis, do you want to say anything about that?
Well, I'll say that it's been a semester-long program. We had opening reception in January, and it closes Saturday. So
No, go now.
There have been several lectures one tonight. One lecture is tonight, and that lecture's
Amy Franceschini, Future Farmers.
where is it?
Oh, it's at Morse Auditorium.
Morse
At
Auditorium.
Morse, okay.
And then another one at Morse Auditorium on the 18th of April with Chris Jordan, the photographer who his message is about our consumption. And then on the 23rd, sorry to take so much time here, but there's a lot going on. The 23rd of April is a major event we're doing, which will be at the Sci Center, which will be a group from Utah, a string quartet, and a physicist to talk about climate change, to talk about our impact on the environment, and the relationship between art and science, and really bringing those together. And I'm hoping everybody can be there and engage in this conversation. It should be really excellent.
That's great. There's also been work going on at the Pardee Center, so this is like a logical crucible for cultivating this program. This is one of the documents on the idea of going back to a functional world economy. And it despairs that it's not so easy to press the reset button, that things can't just go back the way they were very, very readily. One of the initiatives that I've been leading is a group of faculty and postdocs, both at this institution and some sister institutions, where we're trying to come up with a computational basis for looking at alternative scenarios that result from a policy change. And this is literally a computer model of the good things people get from nature and how they change if we alter our behavior. The practice of using this approach is called ecosystem-based management, and the science that fuels it is called coupled human and natural systems. It used to be called ecology. I don't know what happened to that. But, so what we're trying to do is create computer models that capture what we call the flow of ecosystem services. So like access to food, cleaning the water, air to breathe, that allow us to anticipate emerging health issues, that help us to ensure that we don't wipe out half the life on Earth, which is where we're headed right now, deals with shifts in things like nutritional status and well-being in people.
Can I see the previous slide again?
I'm sorry?
Previous slide.
Previous slide, yeah.
Oh, you keep, okay.
It'll get worse. I'll show you another one. That's
We can't go backwards.
yeah, no. We have just,
Turned out
we are living in a science fiction world here. We have another button now
New button.
that can go forwards and backwards. Anyway, the point is to use the model as a scaffold for all of our knowledge, to organize the knowledge, and use it one way or another to anticipate likely changes, the way the world will look if we alter our behavior this way versus that way. The unit of study is a watershed, and this is something that traditional societies have recognized for thousands of years, that people are functional units within a watershed. In modern society, we've abandoned that notion, even though the world still works that way, despite how we'd like it to work. And we've begun several major projects now, one of which, just beginning, is in Cambodia. And some members of the team are in the audience. Irit Altman, you want to?
I'm working on this project.
We have, there's Irit, there's a survivalist Dutch farmer in Vermont named Roel Boman. We have a couple of other modelers, postdocs, grad students working on the project. And what we're working on here is the threat to the engine that provides 80% of the protein to Cambodia. And that is a river that backs up every year during the monsoon into an enormous lake called Tonle Sap, which produces 350,000 tons of fish a year. And people just wall off the end of the lake, and when it all drains out, the fish get caught in the net. And when you go to Knott Pub and use fish sauce, this is where it comes from fermented fish, mostly from Tonle Sap. However, also in Tonle Sap are all these other These are just the fishes. I haven't shown you the butterflies and the reptiles and the trees. It's an astonishing biodiversity hotspot. Now, China is under severe scrutiny for burning too much coal. Their solution? Dam all of Southeast Asia and get clean energy. The problem is the dams on the Mekong system, all 200 of them, are going to arrest the flood pulse cycle and terminate the production of fish in the Tonle Sap, displacing 3 million people, robbing them of protein, and basically creating this question of where all these people are going to go. Now, these kind of watershed problems are reiterated all over the world. They are at the very crux of development. Jim is working in Ethiopia and trying to lure me there. But it's essentially the same cluster of problems, and they ramify into the watershed in our agricultural systems, in our healthcare, in our education. So it's the same trade-off everywhere. Either you get clean power, water for your crops, and flood control, or you have fisheries and rich biodiversity, which equates to resilience in your system, abundant livelihoods, and a traditional culture. These decisions are being made every day, and they're being made almost inexorably in the direction of the top of that trade-off equation. And so in order to better understand what's going on, we created something called the Landscape Analysis Partnership, which encompasses the institutions in the US and Australia who have been developing computational methods to address these issues. We have projects now going on in Tonle Sap, in Massachusetts. We're looking at Fiji, Lake Victoria, and we're in the beginning phase of a project in Brazil. But it's basically the same approach, looking at the connection between land or watersheds and coastal ocean, and how human society rests easy or uneasily upon that landscape, and how the landscape as a whole will evolve, driven by climate change, globalization, and local needs. The approach that we use is a computational platform called MIMES that was invented by the Dutch survivalist guy and an ecological economist named Bob Costanza. And basically the idea is we look at everything nature provides, we look at what we do with that stuff in our economy, and the flow back and forth is called an ecosystem service. This is what the model looks like. It has an interface with stocks, flows, and then equations that alter the flows called converters. That's not so attractive, but in order to visualize it, Professor Gopal and her crew from Earth and Environment have been developing computer game environments that allow people to look at the output of the model, make decisions, and see what the outcome would be. Our best developed model so far is in Massachusetts, and it revolves around the important flow of values of all sorts, fishery, ecotourism, recreation, from tiny areas where cold water upwells on the lee side of these offshore banks. You get bursts of productivity, bursts of fish, whales, birds, and then people converge on these tiny areas to exact their livelihoods. This is just one example of an output from one of these models. And what we see as you go, the base, the X and Y axes are space in our study area. This is at the border of Massachusetts and New Hampshire, northern part of Mass Bay. And as you go up on the Y-axis, that's through 1 year. What you're looking at is the spatial and temporal distribution of value of livelihood from whale watching. And it's driven by the basic physical processes that cause whales to aggregate. Those physical processes are subject to disturbance by other human activities. And so in this user interface snapshot, what you can see on the left is a map of where value will be lost to whale watching if we allow fishery on the fish that the whales eat. So these trade-offs can be visualized and calculated, and then it's not up to us to make the decision, but at least we can lay the options out for people. And we're hoping to do something like this in Cambodia, but of course there we're dealing with much more fundamental issues and basically life and death. An important part of this science on the biophysical side is understanding couplings between different parts of the system. In this case, one of Suchi's grad students, Marta Ribera, has looked at the relationship between plankton blooms on the ocean surface and abundant sea life on the sea bottom, which is what the cod eat, which is what drives our fishery. We've also recently began to develop the model's ability to deal with watershed dynamics. We did this by teaming up with Mass Audubon to look at one of their sanctuaries. And this is part of a mad scheme because, in fact, these sanctuaries permeate the whole state. So if we can use them as nodes for understanding how we interact with our landscape, we have a ready-made network that would allow us to enable planning on a statewide level. Massachusetts Audubon is concerned about biodiversity. It wants to preserve forest birds like the thrush, wood thrush, birds that require late successional habitats, shrub like the prairie warbler, which now is mostly restricted to powerline right-of-ways, and the bobolink, which lives on grassland environments, which are disappearing because we're not really an agricultural state anymore. And the housing market was depressed, so trees grew everywhere. And that actually had a profound impact on wildlife, which may not be the most important thing to everybody, but it's something we are concerned about and we are legally bound to be concerned about. Now, the key to all this, whether in Massachusetts or Ethiopia or Indonesia, is to understand the evolution of the landscape over time. And in order to do that, we've teamed up with Curtis Woodcock and Earth and Environment in order to mine 38 years of Landsat data that are now freely available. It's an Earth observing satellite. And we're writing software that picks up change in the landscape. And then that goes into this model, which interprets the change in ecosystem function and the resulting change in the distribution of values, jobs, sectors of the economy. So that's a computational approach to these problems that Cheryl and Susie have been talking about, but it's clearly not the whole story, and it's missing the whole cultural side, the social side, human health, and the question is how to fold all of these elements together into a coherent program. Where are the big questions? Where are the frontiers? Instead of just falling into doing what everybody else is doing, can we construct a strategic attack on the intellectual challenge of sustainability and work on the ground in real systems to effect change that'll make people's lives better? So we're open to questions and thoughts. Jim?
My name is Rich Rosen from the TELUS Institute. We, of course, do modeling of long-range scenarios at a very large-scale level, but maybe we could talk offline about meeting in the middle somehow. But my question is first about the Indonesian situation. You didn't talk too much about the long-term trends. Is there extremely rapid move in the direction, say, of palm oil plantations, or has that been slowed or halted, or what do you see happening there?
Yeah, actually, I could show you. I didn't show you, but I have a picture that shows the Landsat images across time. I don't know if you want to pull that up, but we don't need to. But well, it's been pretty. Let's see. I don't know if I can put a quantitative measure on it, but essentially, all the areas around the national park are pretty much all designated as being palm oil. Now, they haven't all been converted to palm oil, but they have sort of been given these concessions to cut down, almost, sort of rimming the whole area. And that's a huge sort of, this huge area, like I said, almost the same size as the protected area outside. So it's it's definitely progressing at a pretty rapid rate. And I think it's progressing less maybe than if people weren't doing anything about it. So, sort of trying to sort of halt some of that progression. But it's an uphill battle.
And do you work with the ecosystem analysts to look at things like greenhouse gas emissions from converted land and that kind of thing?
No, I haven't, but that would be great. I mean, we haven't really tapped into other people coming in to look with those skills to do that.
That was amazing, and I think what we can see is wanting to make the links between these areas of focus. I'm thinking of one which would be a model similar to what you had on the fisheries off the coast of New England. Add to that dengue as you're looking for habitat of vector, you're looking for the vector, and you're looking for other kinds of characteristics that end up with an infection of dengue or malaria or you name it, or even non-communicable diseases. This is amazing. I mean, I shouldn't be saying that, right? Because I'm in-house.
Part of it,
But
you're totally unbiased.
But those are the
observer.
connections we now hope that you will make and that other people will be able to begin to contribute to this project.
Right. So Cambodia is actually our first attempt at something like that because we have this huge area. The lake expands 5 times its size every year. And all of the water that it leaves behind has the potential to generate food or suffering because there are waterborne diseases. One of the things we've learned going into new areas, like I was in Palau last summer, and they were requesting our assistance in this kind of modeling and forecasting. And I thought we'd have problems with tropical disease. And it's, as you were saying, Susie, the big problem is NCDs. Because it's an Americanized culture, and everybody sits around eating Fritos and basically doing nothing. And their native culture had very strong values for education and for doing productive things, and they're just out of it. So we need to incorporate all of that. But I think the disease driver, I mean, some of the stuff you were showing, Susie, is downright frightening. Whether they're NCDs or waterborne disease, I think those immediate life-threatening issues are the ones that people are going to resonate to first.
I have actually a thought here. One of my favorite facts to use with my students is there are more people in the world who have a cell phone than who have a toilet. Now, normally I put a negative spin on this. This is a terrible thing, I would rather have a toilet and blah, blah, wouldn't you rather have a toilet? However, the fact that there are so many cell phones out there is something we could harness. If we think about those pictures from the WIBO, the pictures of the rivers, not all the cell phones out there have, a lot of them are dumb phones and they may not even have a camera, but as in sort of a remote sensing, but from the ground rather than from, the satellite, there's a lot of potential for using those cell phones and harnessing people as reporters, but also then as activists by knowing that, I should be looking for logging, I'm taking a picture of this logging, or I'm reporting a GPS coordinate of somebody's cutting a tree, and I'm reporting that back somewhere.
So Susie, we're actually going to institute a system in Massachusetts called Adopt a Pixel. Mm-hmm. And the satellite data is still in need of ground truthing. And one of the key problems in human natural dynamics is we've lost a sense of place. People don't go outside and learn about their surround. So we hope to use local people as our guinea pigs, the indigenous people of Massachusetts, right? Mm-hmm. And make them use their cell phones and report what's going on in each of the pixels so we can ground truth it to the Landsat image.
Yeah.
And actually, in where we're working, one of my colleagues has actually been trying to develop a computer system that does that with cell phones to report illegal logging. And so, because everybody has a cell phone, and setting up a system like that.
But then they're aware of what's going on.
Yes.
They can't ignore it anymore.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And then they sell you the picture, and then they use the money to buy a toilet.
And then they can talk to the toilet.
My name's Adam Patanchis from EASE. And my question, are you mapping the business interests with the same rigor that you're doing all these other things? Because at the end of the day, I mean, I saw that in the, fisheries ecosystem where you're doing that, but that's what's driving the destruction. So unless that's understood with the same level as the consequences, how can you change that at its root?
Well, in Massachusetts, it's not so hard. I mean, it is hard. I mean, Eric can speak to this. I mean, data are usually aggregated the wrong way.
But they're, in this area, they're available. And so if you pay attention to the attributes that matter, then you can certainly track them and provide some understanding about where the opportunities are and are not. And, you do that in a data-rich place like Massachusetts, like the Northeast, and you get pretty good results. In data-poor places, you have to use the other information that's available. But it's one of the most important things that you need to do because, of course, at the end of the day, that's what's going to matter to the communities, and that's what's going to, that's what's going to motivate people to act differently, or motivate their decision-making at least.
Can I just actually, I just want to follow up on his question. A lot of the problems with NCDs, they come across that exact problem, that with a lot of the child diseases and maternal health, there's not a lot of companies that are making a lot of money off of those behaviors or infectious diseases. But there are companies making a lot of money off of cigarettes, junk food, and other things that are leading to the burden of NCDs. So it's going to be very, very challenging. I don't have an answer, but I think identifying the problem, and then citizen activism, I think, is a real interesting thing. I think I live in JP, and there's a youth center. They've taken over part of a building for like a youth health center, and somebody's put together like this homemade poster of how many spoons of sugar are in a Coke, and it's a pretty impressive number. And so the kids who go into this center for whatever, yoga classes and early parenting classes and whatever, they walk past this poster that's showing them like 10 or 12 teaspoons of sugar. So, the awareness, I think, starts to go. And I think one of the most successful cigarette ads was the one, or anti-tobacco, was the one that was showing kids how they were being manipulated by the industry. And they really hated the idea that somebody was kind of manipulating them and making them do things that they didn't want to do. And that was, pretty effective. So I think we have some tools. The money is very unequally, and now of course corporations are people, so they can spend at will on anything. Don't even get me started on that one. But we do have some tools. We need to implement them more and develop new tools. So. And beyond the U.S., I think there's a virgin territory in terms of these things. People in China do not yet know that smoking causes cancer. They don't know smoking is bad for you. They don't even know until they tried that you can't just quit from one day to the next. And the government has deliberately kept them in ignorance. It suits them. It, until maybe now, has suited them in the past to just keep selling them cigarettes. Cigarettes are important part of every festival, every wedding. Big amounts of cigarettes are given as gifts, and it's so they're where we were 50, 60 years ago in terms of awareness. It's very ground zero.
Yeah, and it's the coupling of the what's the short-term profitability versus the long-term social cost.
Yeah.
And then bringing.
And they are going to pay a very high social cost because this 421. That one person is not only going to be supporting a lot of elderly people, it's going to be a lot of sick elderly people. Well, maybe they won't get to be so elderly because they're going to die prematurely of lung cancer and smoking-related COPD and so on.
There's a question back there.
Yeah, my name is Rachel Thrasher. I'm largely with the Pardee Center. I was struck by the conflict between an effort at clean energy and preserving biodiversity. Are there other examples of this, and are there other options? For example, in your example of China, who wanted to dam all of South Asia so that they could have clean energy?
Well, The issue of moving money, water and power, that's transcendent. It's a major problem that we'll be dealing with globally now, particularly under the climate change scenarios, because water will become increasingly precious and less available to communities, biological communities that are obligately dependent on it, like rainforest. So it's becoming very important to get a better understanding of carbon and water. And the frightening thing is we're making progress, but right now we don't actually know for sure in any given case if cutting the forest will mean more water or less water. Or if a particular assemblage like a mangrove forest is absorbing carbon or releasing carbon. So these are very fundamental processes that are right on the cusp of where we might choose to go. Some of the human health issues, some of the bulk dynamic, system dynamic issues, we need to answer those questions before we can propose a solution. So right now our posture is defensive. Like in Cambodia, we're not going to tell China not to build dams, or we could do it till we're blue in the face. It's irrelevant. But we can work with our colleagues there in the local communities and say, look, this is happening to you. These are options for maintaining or improving quality of life given this giant cloud hanging over you. And that's the immediate thing to go for. Beyond that, we need to learn a lot more about governance and human behavior. That's really above my pay grade. And hopefully there are people in the room who understand it better. I know one.
I just had a point exactly on this topic. You probably know, but maybe others don't, that the climate modeling that's done in general, and in particular for the IPCC, and there's a new assessment coming out next year, none of the climate models deal with water.
Yes.
It's beyond
right.
the scope right now. They're just, the modelers are starting to talk about doing it now, but it would be,
It's
I
astonishing.
think, it'd be very difficult though. I think
I think
ultimately,
climate is water, isn't it?
well, I mean, personally, as a modeler, I think you have to go back to the watershed level because, and then incorporate the climate scenarios in terms of temperature rise, and then figure out how that watershed would be impacted by that temperature rise.
That's the approach that we're taking.
Okay.
So in terms of the new program on sustainability, to what extent have you been talking about the organizational framework to be able to affect change on the ground, but also build towards a larger theoretical understanding? And to what extent have the other programs that were on your slide, have they approached that question? Because that's one of the keys, is to sort of take what we have and be able to unify the information in some standardized way so that we can gain a larger insight.
Yeah, that's a good question. Do you guys want to go there first, or? I mean, okay, so I don't want to seem presumptuous because we're not there yet either. But in general, I've been underwhelmed by the strategic acumen or prowess of these programs. They clearly, a lot of our colleagues are recognizing the need, but they're not going about organizing the programs in a pointed, a systematic way. It may generate a lot of good basic understanding, kind of stochastically on the map of what we need to know. I'm not suggesting that that's bad, but I think what we can bring to it is a little more strategic thinking. And that might be a place where, if people see that this information we've developed is valuable and actionable, whichever action they take, the fact that we can help prepare them for the consequences, they'll see value in it. I think that's a place we need to go. So, Irit, our colleagues at the Bren School at UCSB think this way, very pragmatically. Stanford, from afar, looked like it had a wonderful program, and then a colleague from Stanford came to review one of our departments here at BU, and I offered that we should be like Stanford, and he goes, no, don't do that. So I think we're all learning at the same time, and as far as where we are at BU, you're witnessing, it's maybe not even late gestation. This is sort of the sexy part, the conception. And I think we need everyone's contribution and assistance to ensure that we don't become just another, pat program of a university basically addressing market demand. I want to be way out front. And in our work with Massachusetts, you've experienced this. I mean, they think we're too way out front. They think we're way out. And, they don't want to deal with this crap. They have more immediate concerns. So that's where I want to go.
I think there's a role for policy analysis, which as a discipline is a little bit young. I mean, there's a lot been written, but actually structures and even now a piece of software that's very helpful for thinking through, okay, what is the policy we're trying to implement or we're looking at? What are its main characteristics? And who are the stakeholders? And how strong are they? And which side do they line up on? How strong are they? What about the non-mobilized stakeholders who could be mobilized on your side? And then strategies for neutralizing the baddies, the bad guys, and supporting the good guys, and so on. We could think about some of these, building in some of that kind of thinking into it.
That's an important
Like in your fisheries example, the fishermen on one side and the tour guides on the other, I suppose. And so weighing all that up, I think, is quite an interesting way to look at it. And then you can even draw up maps and not map is maybe schematic diagrams and analyze the likelihood of success.
Yeah, I think the
of
most
certain policy
exciting thing
changes.
is what are the people going to do and why do they do it?
Yeah.
Decision theory and understanding behavioral psychology at that level.
Yeah.
That's really where it's at. How to come up with incentive structures that actually move society. That's all the stuff I don't know anything about. But hopefully you guys do and will take us there.
I just want to make a suggestion. It's really interesting how you're trying to combine a variety of disciplines. And of course, as an economist, I'm thinking, all of this, the public health and the biology is fascinating and the systems analysis is really useful. You need the business piece in it. You need the policy piece in it. As an economist, I'm listening to you talk about diets and thinking, there's a lot about U.S. agricultural subsidy policies or agricultural policies. There's a lot about EU policies about biofuels that affect what we grow, whether we're growing palm oil or not, Nutella protesters aside, right? And what kinds of things we're eating. One idea might be to say, pick one topic which might be about our agricultural systems and run across, try to use this systems approach, this interdisciplinary approach to see the many ways, to map out the many ways in which things are distorted and we don't like where we're going. So I could imagine, given what I've heard today, that agricultural strategies, their impact on biodiversity, their impact on public health, and mapping that out in a systems way might work. Or another strategy might be to look at water policies. And we didn't hear a lot about policies on Tonle Sap, but certainly Hillary Clinton, as I understood it, Hillary Clinton told Laos last year, you approved that dam and you're not getting another dime from the United States. So there's a policy piece in there.
Right.
But one could look again at water through this interdisciplinary, systematic, we think interdisciplinary all over the map, but a very systematic interdisciplinary approach to water. But I guess I would also suggest pick one theme that goes through that.
I like that idea
even
very
if that
much.
shifts, even if in a couple of years it shifts direction from ag to water to climate change, it might help in terms of getting the program off the ground.
So another idea in line with that is, even within the discipline, if you have a focal issue that you're dealing with, if you can get many data points across a landscape, then you can draw larger conclusions about lawful processes or not. And that to me is sort of a critical link that's missing right now in the field. Is that even though there's
People with
there's
the cell phones?
What's that?
The people with the cell phones.
they're not missing in the field. I think that actually there's a lot of case studies available, but being able to sort of harness that information in a sort of meta-analysis type of way hasn't been done. And people, I mean, from the recent meeting that I was just at, which was a training for ecosystem service tools, one of the surprising things to me, and it was at Stanford, hosted by the Woods Institute, one of the very surprising things to me was, how hungry the user community is for these tools. That was a little bit surprising, but because there are so many instances where these tools have been used, it was surprising that more study and focus had not been done to harness the results of that information. So what are all these case studies actually telling us? There doesn't seem to be a large focus, at least based on the meeting that I was at, on analyzing that information. So
That's the
I think it's a huge
the
opportunity.
leading approach right now is that one.
Yeah.
So. Yeah.
I want to just do a quick commercial for the Pardee Center, very apropos of what we've been talking about. Our latest publication, which was written by one of our summer fellows from last year's class, is about building of dams in Africa and the connections to human health, public health. And because she's an engineer, she's talking about specific engineering considerations that can be built into thinking about dams. And there's a big meeting coming up apparently in the middle of April. And she's suggesting that at the moment it's about large dams and public health isn't on the agenda at all.
Wow.
And so she sort of takes them to task for that and goes through some examples of how very specific engineering interventions might help prevent things like, the spread of malaria and schistosomiasis and some of the other waterborne diseases. So just wanted to do a little commercial for that since it was apropos. It's hot off the press and there are copies on our stairway.
Great.
So with that,
And I'd like to thank everybody for coming. And there's sort of a core group interested in helping to develop this program, and we'll publicize what's coming out of it, maybe invite people to come to some larger group meetings, and hopefully we'll get this off the ground. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
thank you.